Okay, I'm going to get started. Thank you for joining us today for our book launch, Tastemakers, Collectors, and Patrons, Collecting American Art in the Long 19th Century, edited by Linda S. Ferber and Margaret R. Laster. What you see for you is the lineup for today's event. I'm just going to give you brief housekeeping details, Zoom housekeeping details as they are. If you have questions for the panelists or the editors, please use the Q&A function. At the end of the panel discussion, we have 15 minutes, hopefully, for the audience Q&A, and I will be running that at the end. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Linda Ferber for her introductory remarks. Thanks.
Good afternoon, and I join in Samantha's welcome. This is a moment that we've all waited for seems like a very long time, and we're very glad that you're here. I have the pleasure of thanking the funders who have made this possible today, and the fine volume that we're here to speak about today. Joanne Witte and Eugene Kalin Fund at the New York Community Trust, the Billy Rose Foundation, Marianne and Reed Greenwood. And this is the team that has made this possible by financial support. The Frick has been wonderfully supportive of this project through trials and tribulations, as have the authors. It included, of course, the lockdown during COVID, but particularly I want to thank Ian Wardroper, Stephen Burry, Anastasia Levadis, Louisa Wood Ruby, and my partners in crime on the book, Samantha Deutsch, and my co-volume editor, Margaret Laster, and of course, the authors, five of whom are here with us today, and others whom I hope are among the audience. That's the next, Samantha. This is the final volume in the distinguished series published as a partnership between the Frick Collection, Studies in the History of Art Collecting in America, and Pennsylvania State University Press. And you see the covers here. And we are particularly happy that our book is the final of the 6 volumes, but preceding it is Edward Sullivan's terrific volume, The Americas Revealed. So that at the end of the day, while the core of this this corpus of volumes is Old Master painting, which is the sweet spot, of course, of the Frick. The Americas are represented north and south by what are really, in a way, particularly, I think, for the Americas Revealed, pioneering volumes in studying the phenomenon of collecting the arts of colonial and Latin America. Okay. Good. May I have the next, please, Samantha? I want to return to the cover, and you always select, of course, a particularly resonant image for the cover of a volume, and we have not been exceptions to that. Could I have the painting? This is, of course, Asher B. Durand's iconic work, Kindred Spirits, a painting of 1849. Nicely positioned, almost in the middle of the span, this very long span of this of our inquiry, and it epitomizes for me, and I hope as you unpack this book for you, it really epitomizes the complex world of American collecting. This is a period before the Civil War. But it's an early infrastructure that's really pictorialized here. What we see is, of course, the site is the Catskill Clove, but the creative environment in which this instant icon was created by Asher B. Durand was New York City. And it does usually take a village, but more often a city, to support the infrastructure of collecting, which is highly complex. Many of the players are represented here, which makes this a marvelously resonant work. Of course, the artist Thomas Cole is memorialized in this painting, which was the catalyst for which, unfortunately, was his premature death in 1848. He stands with William Cullen Bryant, who is honored here for his eulogy of Cole, but also for the fact that he was a critical tastemaker. He was the publisher by then. He was a poet, but he was the publisher of the New York Evening Post, one of the major champions in the press and criticism of the Hudson River School, of the American school in general. Our patron here, unseen, is Jonathan Sturgis, and an important collector who actually commissioned this work from Asher B. Durand for William Cullen Bryant because of his eulogy of Cole. And then the artist himself, Asher B. Durand, whose initials are carved in the tree in the lower left, is the artist who created the instant icon. So it's about collecting, it's about the infrastructure of collecting, and for me, it's also about legacy, which I think launches the stories that are told in this volume, all of which have in some way to do with issues of legacy in many different dimensions. So with that, I turn this over to Margaret Laster, who will walk us through the essays of a number of her own chapter and those of the authors who could not be with us today. Margaret.
Oh, hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I hope. I am delighted to be here with you for the launch of Tastemakers, Collectors, and Patrons. And I, too, would like to express my gratitude to all who supported this publication, especially Samantha Deutsch, the series editor, and Linda Ferber, my co-volume editor, as well as I wish to thank all the authors. Tastemakers, Collectors, and Patrons explores the dynamic landscape of American art collecting in the United States from the late 18th through the early 20th centuries, what we have coined the long 19th century. Essays examine early patrons, collectors, and museum founders, the impact of sectionalism, the Civil War, and reform on American collecting, and the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit of artists, collectors, and dealers at the turn of the century and beyond. Each section foregrounds different issues, underscoring the complexity of the historical, cultural, and political environments in which collections of American art were formed. And as a whole, the volume traces the evolving taste and market for American art in the United States. My role today is to present a brief overview, a snapshot of the publication, focusing on the essays whose authors are not presenting today. When self-made merchant Luman Reed died intestate in 1836, the intact survival of his entire collection, including his 5-part series, The Course of Empire, the central image of which you see here, was cast into doubt. If a collector's legacy can be assessed, at least in part, by the eventual disposition of what he or she collected, then Reed's untimely death without a will left unresolved whether his art holdings would be kept together or dispersed. Not only were the individual works of art themselves itinerant for periods of time, but the collection as a whole faced the dire prospect of dissolution on more than one occasion. That Cole's series still stands as one unit, neither divided among disparate owners nor lost to us entirely, and remains with the rest of Reed's holdings, today comprising one of the oldest public collections of American art, formed from a single private repository in the city of New York, if not the nation, is itself a remarkable story. It is the end product of luck and interlocking directorates among relatives, collectors, artists, friends, and associates who aligned and preserved the collection. Notably among this group, and granted agency in my essay for her role in the preservation of his holdings, is Reed's wife, Mary Barker Reed. Her role in keeping the collection together in the immediate aftermath of her husband's death, I would argue, set the stage for the founding of the New York Gallery of the Fine Arts, a quasi-public gallery, the first in the city, as well as a monument to Reed himself, that housed the collection starting in 1844. The New York Gallery would ultimately prove an unsustainable effort to create a public collection of American art, but it would serve as an instrument to realize Reed's goal, we believe, of keeping his collection whole, an objective eventually made permanent through deposit in 1858, securely in the public sphere at the New York Historical Society, the oldest museum in New York. And here is a real find at the wax-sealed transfer document. We now move new ground, a series of paintings from the 1860s that constituted a revisionist approach to landscape and still life, grounded in the politics of the day. A belief that idealized landscape representation that presented America as a new Eden disguised the corruption at the heart of the nation's democratic experiment. As author Sophie Linford reveals, the artists formed the Association for the Advancement of Truth in Art, where together with architects, scientists, and critics, and saw themselves as reformers frustrated with the Civil War, as were the dedicated community of patrons, also part of this association, who collected and commissioned their work, and possessed a steadfast belief in John Ruskin's theories on the ethical relationship between art, labor, and society. And central among their goals was for the abolition of slavery. And here we have a still life painting by John William Hill and an image of the owner, the collector Gordon Lester Ford, a major Brooklyn abolitionist. Next, we have Sarah Cash's essay, Encouraging American Genius, which recounts the collecting career of Washington, D.C. financier, philanthropist, and Southern sympathizer William Wilson Corcoran, who would cement his legacy with an eponymous gallery, the nation's first purpose-built art museum to house his growing collection of American and European art. Construction on the museum had halted during the Civil War when Corcoran decamped to Europe due to his political allegiances, and the U.S. government appropriated the building for the duration of the war until 1869, when Corcoran liquidated his financial ties to the South and resumed construction on his museum diagonally across from the White House. And here is the first museum building, which opened in 1874 to great fanfare. One paper noted it was a benefaction to the whole country, a gallery of fine arts to rival the most famous collections in the world. However, in 2014, after 140 years in existence, the Corcoran Gallery and School remains no longer. The collection was redistributed, and much of it is now housed at the National Gallery. Headlining the beginning of our final section, part 3, we see that the Untermeyer Gardens Conservancy is still housed in Yonkers, New York, and Samuel Untermeyer's reputation as a New York attorney who left an undeniable mark on the early 20th century economic, political, and legislative affairs in the United States remains intact. However, the art collection that Untermeyer, shown here with his wife Millie, compiled was never part of this legacy, nor did he collect for posterity. Following his European counterparts, Untermeyer saw provenance as a form of cultural imprimatur and purchased American and European paintings from auctions of well-vetted collections. Nonetheless, as Barbara Galati states, apart from the 1940 catalog accompanied the auction of portions of his estate, there is little to hint at the extent of his passion for collecting art, other than his having purchased the American expatriates James McNeill Whistler's 1892 Nocturne in black and gold, The Falling Rocket, directly from the artist. The early decades of the 20th century experienced a revival in demand for colonial portraiture, including presidential subjects, as we see in the private business office of Gilded Age Old Master collector Henry Clay Frick. As an art dealer remarked in 1928, the growing estimation of Washington has reached a point that seems to make it necessary for every man of large means to have a Stuart Washington as a household decoration. Indeed, Frick's Stuart Washington is on the back cover of this volume. In his chapter, Caveat Emptor, Richard Saunders brings to light the nefarious side of this trade in colonial portraiture, resulting in deceptive colonial and federal-style portraits passing through the hands of various dealers to dozens of unsuspecting institutions and private collectors during these decades. Among the bad actors was Thomas B. Clark, who had earlier profited from the sale of works by such artists as Winslow Homer and George Inness. In the penultimate essay of this book, Eileen Fort charts the career of William Preston Harrison, a Chicago-born transplant to Los Angeles, and his efforts to cultivate a taste for 19th and 20th century American painting in his adopted hometown, for the then fledgling Los Angeles Museum, or LACMA, an institution he supported and wanted to help elevate to a world-class status. As a collector, Harrison tended to avoid commercial dealers, preferring to deal directly with artists. And he had a strong sense of historical purpose, and with the lack of a canon to rely on, he frequently consulted fellow artists, and most especially the New Yorker Childe Hassam, of whose works he was a major patron. And Hassan became the closest that he had of an artist advisor. And here we see just a few works in the collection. We have a Tanner on the left and a work by Childe Hassam done in California on the right. Notice the local cypresses. Coming to the end, our theme, tastemakers, collectors, and patrons, includes organizations or tastemakers. The book contains 3 such tastemakers dedicated to promoting American art and elevating American taste. The American Pre-Raphaelites from Sophie Linford's essay, the American Art Union before the Civil War, which we will be introduced to when in Kimberly Orcutt's chapter. And a century later, as Julie McGinnis Flanagan details, we have another such effort, more technologically advanced and formed on the site of what was one of the city's greatest transportation hubs in its financial and artistic center, Grand Central Terminal. Called the Grand Central Galleries, it attracted savvy locals and commuters who were traveling on the long distance trains that arrived and departed from the terminal daily. The Grand Central Art Galleries were designed to promote the career of living American artists, including Tanner, Cecilia Bow, John Sloan, and Isamu Noguchi, and to create new collectors and collections. And we see here on the top floor gallery that the light almost appears to be filtering through to the main concourse. Note as well the proximity to the rail tracks. The galleries were able to use the rail system network to promote and exhibit the work of these artists, traveling across towns and cities further afield to such venues as galleries, movie houses, and even hotels, as we see here in this installation photograph in Atlanta. As our author illuminates, the traveling exhibitions that toured the country formed a core part of the Grand Central Art Gallery's stated mission the enlightenment of a larger American art collecting community, and served as the, quote, long overlooked sparks that ignited the passions of would-be collectors, boosters, soon-to-be museum founders, and growing cultural leaders across the United States. And you can really see here in this map what a robust infrastructure this was that required the way that the galleries just expanded across the map, to the Midwest, down south, to the north, even via ship as far west as Hawaii, then a U.S. territory and not a state. And Samantha Deutsch, the Frick's digital art history lead, collaborated with the author, using their data combined with files by Jeremy Attack on a historical geographic information systems database of U.S. railroads for this publication, combining the two to create our map illuminating the known locations of Grand Central Art Gallery's national art exhibition campaigns between 1923 and 1939 within the context of the historical railroad lines. So I want to thank you all, and we will now go back to the beginning of our book with our first panelist, Lamps Humphreys.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm glad to be back here at the Frick again, if only digitally, to discuss Robert Gilmore Jr. again. Gilmore was one of the really most important cultural figures in the United States in the 19th century. And before the Civil War, certainly a major American art collector, as well as just art collector in general. And some of you may be saying, well, if he's so important, why have I never heard of him? And I would say there are three things. He's very early in the history of collecting in this country. He began collecting in the 1790s. He's in Baltimore, Maryland, which is an unlikely place, according to the narrative that we largely hear about art, which is New York and Boston and Philadelphia, et cetera. And his collection was dispersed when he died, which makes it very difficult to kind of grapple with his accomplishments and to be able to kind of just sense the magnitude of what he had been able to pull off during his lifetime. In over 50 years of collecting, Gilmore acquired works by over 50 artists working here in the United States, as early as 1794 with this work by Robert Field, to 1844 with this bust of Henry Clay by Joel Tanner Hart. As I mentioned, he acquired works by over 50 artists, which is really an incredible achievement. Many people couldn't name 50 artists who worked in this period. And the art that he acquired was many of the artists were those who we now think of as kind of founding various schools of painting in the United States, including Thomas Doughty and Thomas Cole in landscape painting, William Sidney Mount with genre painting, Raphael Peale in still life painting. And then in the world of sculpture, he was an early patron of Horatio Greenough, our first kind of native-born artist or sculptor with artistic training. These American works joined hundreds of old masters in his collection. Gilmore felt it was very important to have old masters here for our artists to learn from. We had very few museums, if barely any, in 1800 or 1820 when he's really beginning to collect. And he was very lucky to have acquired a number of very handsome paintings, especially by Dutch and Flemish old masters. And only a handful of them can be identified today, but just this group I'm showing you kind of gives you a sense of the quality of his paintings, which many recognize as being the finest here, perhaps in the 1830 or 40 period. But this art collection was only part of his collection, and he had a number of other collections. And in all of these areas of collecting, he was thought to be one of the earliest collectors in the type of collecting in the world of minerals, manuscripts like this letter by Queen Elizabeth I, very, very rare to be here in the United States, old and modern coinage, ancient and modern coinage, and illuminated manuscripts, as well as Greek pottery. He was probably the first American collector to have a Greek pot exhibited from their collection. And in all of these collecting areas, including art, Gilmore had a very kind of scientific approach to the way he thought about these things. He wasn't a scientist, although he was an amateur scientist. especially in the world of mineralogy, and was highly admired for the work he contributed in that field. And the main thing that he really thought about was how these things could be classified. How is this mineral different than another mineral, and what makes it unique? What are its unique characteristics? And then how can these unique objects kind of be clumped in larger areas of interest that they have similar characteristics while they're different at the same time? And this is something that Gilmore thought about with paintings in particular. How is an American painting unique versus a Dutch painting, but then how are they similar? And this shaped his entire collecting interest really over his lifetime. Today, I'd like to spend most of my time talking about one specific moment in Gilmore's career as a collector and patron, which is his dialogue with Thomas Cole in the late 1820s, when he was commissioning some early paintings by Cole, including a painting that he hoped to depict a scene from The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. In this conversation, excuse me, this is taking place in the late 1820s, Gilmore hoped that Cole would paint a landscape to include this scene, and this elicited from him in a very long dialogue that went on through many letters, actually, that he wanted real American scenes. And he actually underlined the word real American scenes, just like this in the original letter. Well, this made me wonder, like, well, does Gilmore want real American everything by all of the artists that he's patronizing? And what does that look like? But it led to some complications in my understanding of Gilmore, because with that lens that I had for a little while, I could not understand, for instance, why he'd want to acquire this work by Robert Walter Weir, a New York artist, in the early 1830s, depicting Rebecca, which is based on a novel by Sir Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, who obviously Sir Walter Scott is Scottish. And then why Gilmore would want Greenough to commission to create for him this work, Medora, which is based on a tale by Lord Byron, who is British. These just did not make sense to me for a long time until I looked at his other collecting interest and tried to I pulled together threads that were coming together to me about what happened in 1826. And The Last of the Mohicans was published in 1826, and Gilmore is having this dialogue with Cole in the late 1826, about August. And to us, 1826 is not a very important date. We don't think of it as something big and a huge celebration or memorial, but it was the first major milestone in the history of the United States as far as documenting our history, and that we had survived a half century, and that this American experiment had worked and was working. We had had peaceful transfers of power. Our government was functioning, the arts were beginning to flourish, and all of these things were happening and gelling. And this is something that Gilmore wanted to, and others wanted to celebrate and commemorate. And one thing that I learned from other aspects of his collecting is specifically in this period, he is learning that many of those who had manuscripts related to the revolutionary worthies, those who signed the Declaration of Independence, that their heirs had lost or forgotten, or their papers had been lost. And therefore, we were losing this record of what the founding of our country was all about. And so how are we going to preserve this for the future so that an accurate story can be told about the history of the rise of the United States as a new democracy? Well, this played out in his art collecting as well. And in 1825, he commissioned from Gilbert Stuart Stuart's last portrait of George Washington. Stuart had painted hundreds of them, but Gilmore acquired this one in 1825. And importantly, in his collection, it replaced a copy that Gilmore had had after Stuart, really for about a quarter of a century. But in 1825, and as we head into 1826, Gilmore wants a painting by the actual artist for whom George Washington sat, Gilbert Stuart actually saw George Washington, and therefore this piece is more authentic. In 1825, he also turned to John Trumbull. Really at the time, he's talking to Thomas Cole about whether he had any of his miniature heads of worthies of the Revolution for sale. These little portraits, they're very finely detailed, and many of them are very dynamic. Were the studies that Trumbull would later use for his full size canvases, as well as the works he commissioned for the Rotunda, those very heroic works in the Capitol. But these are the original studies, and they're painted closer to the time. And so Gilmore felt that these were more authentic. These were more real. This is what these were. These here, one from South Carolina and one from Maryland, what they actually look like and how they, express themselves visually in their portraiture. So he did acquire these two pieces. And then in 1826, Gilmore was commissioning this heroic statue of George Washington for the top of Baltimore's Washington Monument. The monument in Baltimore is the first one to honor George Washington and also to celebrate the idea of American national independence. As we know from when we restored it, there was a copy of the Declaration of Independence in the cornerstone. So this monument is all about the founding of this country. And here is just yet another thing that Gilmore is doing that has to do with American nationhood and the arts commemorating and celebrating it. So when he says to Cole in 1826, and this is really in August of 1826, that he wants a real American scene for this depiction of this, it was a quasi-historical novel. He's saying to Cole that he wants this scenery in this painting to be uniquely identifiable as American. He doesn't want it to look like the Swiss Alps or the coast of Scotland or the Mediterranean or something. He wants it to be something that people can turn to, and that this image is going to undeniably represent what American scenery looks like for this quasi-historical novel. And this was so important to him that when he puts this work on exhibition at the Pennsylvania Academy in 1828, I believe he sent these descriptions to be included in the catalog. It was described as a composition of real scenes. And then he goes on to describe where the mountain is and where the lake is and where the island is, that these are, he believes, and maybe he was in conversation with Cole about the depictions, but it is the correct mountain that he mentions, that this is undeniably a picture of a real American, at least landscape put together from pieces of the American scenery. So this is just one aspect in the life of Gilmore, a very charged one, I think, about defining American art. He probably should have on his tombstone that guy who wanted real American scenes, because it's been quoted so many times over the past half century. But when you delve into it and you understand what he was looking for and what it meant to him, it's not some picture postcard he's looking for. It's really about authenticity in depicting the history and kind of future of our country. So lots more to talk about in my chapter, especially, and then also in the other chapters in the book. And at this point, I will turn it over to our next panelist, Kimberly Orcutt.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Samantha and Margaret and Linda, especially. And in my brief time today, I'm going to say a few words about the American Art Union in the hope that you will be intrigued enough to read further. And I'll talk a bit about the unique circumstances surrounding this project and how they led to some unexpected conclusions. I am grateful for the opportunity to participate in this project because it helped propel my work toward a digital art history project with 19th century art worldwide and a fuller account in a book titled The American Art Union, Utopia and Skepticism in the Antebellum Era, coming out in July, so please excuse the shameless plug. The American Art Union began in New York in 1838, and in its heyday, a decade later, it boasted nearly 19,000 members from almost every state. For an annual fee of $5, subscribers received a monthly art journal and an engraving after a painting by a notable American artist. And here you see some selections from 1850. Moreover, subscribers' names were entered in a drawing for hundreds of original paintings and sculptures by living American artists. A few examples here. And these works were displayed from April through January at the Art Union's immensely popular Free Gallery on Lower Broadway. According to the organization's records, more than 5,000 works were exhibited there, and over 230,000 people visited each year. The annual drawing for artworks each December was a major social event in New York, attracting crowds of thousands of hopefuls who might, with the luck of the draw, become collectors. Unfortunately, this experiment in art world democracy was short-lived. A sudden and at the time surprising drop in membership in 1851 galvanized long simmering resentments from certain quarters at the organization's power and influence. Accusations of mismanagement led to a court case whose surprising decision brought about the American Art Union's demise. The American Art Union's bold and idealistic plan, of course, prompts the question, why did it fail? And so my essay traces the American Art Union's demise back to causes rooted in the nature of the enterprise itself. Its 14-year course spanned a period of immense growth and great idealism around utopian schemes and bold social experiments. The American Art Union was one such experiment. It was an attempt to build an art world from the ground up and to create and control the many forces that shaped it, including art criticism, canon building, exhibitions, education, and collecting. The Art Union's leadership hoped that its collective purchasing power, fueled by subscriber fees, would free artists from dependence on a few wealthy men by broadening the base of patrons beyond the well-to-do of the East Coast to include the rising middle class of the entire country. However, its activities often produced unintended consequences, results that were the opposite of what the leadership intended and that attracted as much blame as praise. The institution was undone not so much by dramatic outward events as by the invisible incentives and mundane practicalities that shape systems, motivate behavior, and ultimately move worlds, art and otherwise. For instance, the Art Union's leadership had to select original paintings for purchase, which of course caused resentment and questions about their qualifications. Just one of those questions is here. The distribution of artworks by lot fell under scrutiny as an illegal lottery. And the Art Union exacerbated that problem when they purchased Thomas Cole's monumental 4-painting series, The Voyage of Life, for distribution and touted it at a valuation of $6,000 as you would for a big prize in a lottery. The Art Union Bulletin was created as an educational publication, but after a few years, it became a polemical defense of its actions and a venue for accusing its enemies. So just a few more works distributed. The Art Union's dramatic collapse began when its membership dropped from a high of nearly $19,000 to about $11,600 in 1851. And Art Union managers attributed this decline to delays in hearing from Art Union agents soliciting memberships across the country and a general economic downturn, but other pressing issues were not acknowledged, such as the proliferation of competing art unions, bad press, and the question of whether the art union's distribution constituted an illegal lottery. All were spurred by parties who took issue with the art union's control over patronage and subject matter, as well as art criticism and commentary. The organization became the particular target of the sensationalist New York Herald, its editor on the left, which charged them with conducting an illegal lottery, mismanagement and exploitation, and using art union funds for oyster and champagne suppers, and also to fund a new daily abolition journal called the New York Times, whose editor, Henry J. Raymond, on the right, was on the Art Union's management committee. And of course, all these charges were disproven, but they set a series of events in motion that could not be reversed. In 1852, the Art Union took legal action against the New York Herald for libel, and after several months of legal proceedings, the New York Supreme Court decided that their system did indeed constitute an illegal lottery. The organization sold its artworks at auction and ceased operations soon after, and this is one of the works that was sold at auction. The Art Union's aims were forward-looking, to encourage middle-class patronage and create a marketplace for American works of art where merit was rewarded and artists had a wide range of possible buyers or owners who would then have to compete for the works of the very best artists. But the experiment in patronage went awry, and ironically, the American Art Union created what it was trying to avoid. Their collective venture spawned a super patron that had an outsized impact on the art market and generated the unanticipated incentives that develop in an artificial system. However, during its short but spectacular life, the Art Union had substantial successes. And in just one, the annual distribution sent masterworks of American art across the nation. Here you see Duran's Dover Plains, which was awarded to S.W. Allen of Mobile, Alabama, now at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So by providing a groundwork for visual literacy through images and information, connecting distant art enthusiasts in a shared endeavor, and offering the possibility of owning an original work by an esteemed artist, the American Art Union opened the eyes of the nation and created potential collectors around the country. And for me, studying the American Art Union was both a singular opportunity and a unique challenge because of the character of its records held by the New York Historical Society. The foremost challenge is the sheer magnitude of the records, which total 109 bound volumes, including treasurer's accounts, a register of artwork submitted for purchase, press clippings, and thousands of letters to and from artists. Fortunately, the advent of digital tools offers new ways to organize and understand this large body of data, and they reveal a nuanced and sometimes surprising view of the Art Union's activities and impact. For instance, the data allowed me to work with 19th century art worldwide to create an interactive map that shows the impressive cross-country scope of the Art Union's activities, and the bubbles show the size of the membership in all these various parts, and a searchable database so that scholars can look up artists, titles, prices paid, and other information. Also, the organization had a surprising impact on the subjects that artists produced. And here you see a distribution by subject matter. The green is landscapes. In spite of constantly encouraging history painting, they purchased many, many more landscapes than any other subject. And they even impacted the size of paintings and the timing that people made paintings. So I hope that you will find the essay in our book today interesting and that you'll be inspired to learn more. So thank you. And now I'm going to hand off to Betsy Kornhauser.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I was so happy to be part of this wonderful project, and I have to say the book is beautiful. Thank you to all who made it possible. I'll be speaking about two great Hartford, Connecticut collectors whose lives run across the 19th century, and I'm really focusing on their fascination and interest in landscape art, even though they collected more broadly. Daniel Wadsworth, who you see on the right, was an amateur artist with aristocratic roots of the Federal elite, and Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt on the left was an industrialist who took over from her deceased husband, Samuel Colt, to run the Colt Arms Factory after his early demise during the Civil War. And they represent the broad spectrum of patronage in 19th century America, but it is fascinating that they thrived in Hartford, Connecticut, which was a smaller city. They really benefited, and this is sort of at the heart of my essay, from really friendships with leading landscape painters of the time, Thomas Cole and Frederick Church, respectively, who really helped them to form very successful and important collections. They also both benefited from international travel, so they were aware of European artistic traditions. And Wadsworth's artistic and aesthetic achievements in the early Republic would inspire those of Elizabeth Colt, who played an important role during the Civil War. Wadsworth was heir to a mercantile and banking fortune, but he chose to devote his life to establishing a cultural heritage for the new republic by pursuing his own personal interest in landscape art and recent American history. And he would famously meet Thomas Cole in 1826, introduced to Cole by his older mentor and friend of the family, John Trumbull, the great Connecticut artist. This would begin a lifelong friendship, and with Wadsworth serving as an older, somewhat of a mentor. And I think the comparison with Gilmore and Wadsworth and their approaches to coal is a fascinating one, actually. Wadsworth would begin commissioning a whole series of early landscapes in the late 1820s from Thomas Cole, really helping him to launch his career, particularly works of American wilderness. And then Wadsworth famously built his country estate on the top of a wilderness mountain outside of Hartford called Montevideo. And Cole would visit him many times at this location, and he truly appreciated the aesthetic vision of Wadsworth. And here you see in this great painting, he embraces a novel panoramic sweep of the landscape, which was the intent of Wadsworth's high perch. And so you can see how a sort of back and forth between the two men. I think Wadsworth helped to advance Cole's career and vice versa. So Wadsworth would spend his life, making a very large collection, which he housed at Montevideo. And toward the end of his life, he and his wife began to think of a plan for their great collection. And in advance of that, Wadsworth began to think about opening a public art museum in Hartford. And just before that happened, he acquired many important works, including this great late work by Cole, Mount Etna from Taormina, a very grand scale canvas of one of Cole's favorite themes, the rise and decline of great civilizations in the face of nature. And so you can see that these landscapes were intended to elevate and provide moral lessons for the American public. So Wadsworth succeeded very quickly in forming and building this great neo-Gothic style museum, which you see on the left, and Wadsworth is walking there in front of it as an older gentleman on Main Street, where he housed the fine arts collections, which were largely dominated by landscape, but included great history paintings of the American Revolution by John Trumbull and others, and then flanked by a natural history museum and a library. And another great contribution Wadsworth made before his death in 1848, the same year as Cole's death, interestingly, was to introduce the young emerging artist Frederick Church, who was a member of an affluent Hartford family and friends with Wadsworth, to Thomas Cole, who took him on in his studio for 2 years. And that was a very important moment in the evolution of landscape art. So we leave the first half of the 19th century and move to the second half with young Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt from another prominent Hartford family. She was a friend of the Wadsworths and certainly took great advantage of visiting the Wadsworth Athenaeum as a young woman. She would famously marry Samuel Colt in 1856, which transformed her life. The couple built a large mansion called Armsmere, which sat just above the great Colt factory on the Connecticut River, which was an amazing manufacturing site for the United States. And by this point, Samuel Colt had become an internationally renowned arms maker. But he would die an untimely death in 1862. And rather than retreating to Armsmere, to her domestic world, Elizabeth, who was a firm supporter of the Union and an abolitionist, took on the running of the arms manufactory, supplying arms to the Union Army exclusively during the course of the Civil War. And it was at a Civil War event that Church and Elizabeth really came together to plan her private picture gallery. Elizabeth participated in the famous Metropolitan Sanitary Fair, where she hosted the Hartford table and sold tea cakes that she made herself and sold out her Colt arms supply on the first day, according to the New York Times. Church was deeply involved in the picture gallery, where he helped to install this, which you see on the right, this very patriotic installation that harked back to the founding of the United States and was intended to fuel patriotism to push through and win the Civil War. You see Emanuel Leutitz's great Washington crossing the Delaware on the north wall, flanked by Church's famous, by that point, Heart of the Andes, and to the left, Albert Bierstadt's Rocky Mountain Landers Peak. And it was here you see these two great pictures. And the hang really was successful in fueling patriotism. In fact, Church's Heart of the Andes in its original window frame was overhung with 3 portraits of presidents borrowed from the New York Historical Society. So this really launched the inspiration in Elizabeth's mind. She was really fearless in the face of male-dominated worlds, whether it was industry or the art world, and decided she would create her own private picture gallery at Armsmere. And Church was with her every step of the way. He introduced her to leading artists in the 10th Street studio. She commissioned works from Albert Bierstadt, from Sanford Gifford. And then the great commission of the gallery was Church's Vale of St. Thomas, Jamaica, which I'll show you in a minute. But you can see how successful her private gallery was. And the success in large part was owed to Church's involvement. His great Vale of St. Thomas, Jamaica, and its original Church-designed frame was a very personal undertaking. I've written extensively about this, but I wanted to make the point that it kind of reflected their shared commitment to the Union cause and to the abolitionist movement, in that painted on the island of Jamaica just before a major insurrection on that island, the theme of the painting is the legacy of slavery. And so I want to end with this great work to just show how important the works were that these two great collectors commissioned of the artists that they were so close to. And, you know, I really think it's one of the fascinating aspects of these Hartford collectors that they weren't just patron artists. They were deeply involved with each other and fueled each other's careers and collecting habits. And some of the events that happened between these 4 people really led to the success of the formation of a landscape tradition in America in the 19th century. So I'm going to end here and pass it on to Lynn Ambrosio.
Today I'm representing, I want to thank Linda Ferber, Margaret Laster, Samantha Deutsch, and everyone else involved in the production of what is, in the end, a beautiful book. Today, I'm representing the West, as Easterners called Ohio, in the, excuse me, I'm just going to move something. Great. I had to move something around on my screen so I can see my notes. Thanks for your patience. Today, I'm representing the West, as Easterners called Ohio in 1860. The city of Cincinnati, circled on the map, held a strategic position on the Ohio River, linked to Lake Erie by canal and to the south by the Mississippi River. It was the Western capital of trade, industry, and culture from about 1830 to about 1880, when it yielded to Chicago. Cincinnati sat on the Mason-Dixon line that divided free and slave states, so opinions there were sharply divided on the important issues of slavery and abolition. The Cincinnatian Nicholas Longworth was known throughout the country at mid-century for his legendary wealth. A small, wiry, eccentric man who dressed shabbily, Longworth was shrewd, well-informed, and opinionated. All right, so sorry. He had two avocations, horticulture and art patronage. He made the first commercially viable American wines, which dominated the pre-Civil War market. And among his 14 artistic protégés were the sculptor Hiram Powers and the African-American painter Robert S. Duncanson. In studying Longworth, I have relied most heavily on old biographical dictionaries, period newspapers, and his own candid and often biting correspondence. I've also drawn on the accounts of his patronage that Denny Young, Abby Schwartz, and Paul Breidenbach wrote in the 1980s and 90s. However, I've reached some conclusions that differ substantially from earlier writers. First, my assessment of the importance of Longworth's art collection parts company with theirs. Second, I've learned that we've been wrong about Longworth's motives for supporting Duncanson. Contrary to past assumptions, his aid for the African-American artist did not stem from an abolitionist stance. Born in genteel poverty in New Jersey, Longworth settled by 1804 in the small city of Cincinnati. There he practiced law, but soon found his golden goose in the Western land boom. He bought and sold countless regional properties over a period in which that land was doubling in value every 3 to 5 years. Tales circulated across the country about his extraordinarily generous philanthropy, but also about his cutthroat legal tactics. One acquaintance called him a problem and a riddle. In 1830, Longworth purchased a federal period house, now part of the Taft Museum of Art. It was big enough to house the huge canvas that he bought at a New York auction in 1828, Benjamin West's Ophelia. This was really the only first-rate picture that Longworth ever owned, as far as we know for sure. In fact, looking into his collection, I argue that he had his real impact not as a connoisseur collector, but as an old-fashioned patron, a benefactor. Beginning in the late 20s, Longworth offered support to some 14 artists. Only one refused it, and angrily, James Henry Beard. I explore why the offer was conditional, and I also interpret this painting, Beard's Ohio Land Speculator, as a veiled criticism of the best-known Ohio land speculator, Nicholas Longworth himself. For 30 years, Longworth helped sustain the marble sculptor Hiram Powers, first in Cincinnati, then in Washington, D.C., and finally in Florence, Italy. In gratitude, Powers carved and sent this bust to his patron. Longworth supplied Powers with funds, only 1 or 2 commissions, and abundant advice, mostly concerning pricing, marketing, and politics. The philanthropist's second sculptural protege, Shobal Clevenger, died tragically after only 3 years in Florence. Longworth's governing motive was boosterism, a deep commitment to spurring the success of Cincinnati with which he identified. For example, he assisted John Wilde in the hope that his lithographs would persuade people to move to the city. I learned this and other interesting facts from the patron's revealing letters, which express both his purposes and his confident belief that he knew best. For example, he wrote to the young artist Thomas B. Reed, who had just controverted Longworth's plans for him, quote, "Sir, I enclose to you $50, though not in accordance with my own judgment. You are on a visionary experiment, and disappointment will attend you. I have lost all hope of your ever becoming a painter," unquote. Among the other artists that Longworth assisted were William Henry Powell, for whom he pulled political strings in Washington, Worthington Whitridge, who painted vistas found in southern Ohio and Kentucky, Alexander Wyant, who did the same, and Lily Martin Spencer, whom Longworth helped establish in New York. As a patron, he urged his own views and values on the artists he groomed, an activist approach. About 1850, Longworth invited Robert Duncanson to decorate the foyer of his home, launching the painter's career. They 8 large landscape murals that he painted, each enclosed in a trompe-l'oeil frame, simulated a picture gallery. Evidently pleased with the results, Longworth then provided his protege with 9 months of travel and study in Europe. Considering both Duncanson and Lily Martin Spencer, it's clear that Longworth demonstrated a precocious tolerance of difference in both race and gender. But was this because he was an abolitionist? Initially, I too assumed so. However, certain facts puzzled me. In his youth, he spent 2 years in South Carolina and formed lasting attachments there. Moreover, he had 2 brothers who were lifelong owners of plantations worked by many enslaved people. How did these facts square with Longworth's supposed abolitionism? Then I made a discovery, a long, obscure letter that Longworth sent to a newspaper in the South in 1860, which unlocked his perspectives for me. In the letter, he stated that he approved the continuation of slavery in the South and thoroughly opposed abolition. To read some of this text, to learn more about his anti-abolitionist activities in Cincinnati, and to hear why I think he supported Duncanson, I refer you to chapter 5 of the new book. I'm supposed to not reveal all in my talk by strict instructions. So for now, out of time, I'll conclude by repeating that Longworth took on the goal of cultivating local talent, thus building Cincinnati's prestige, while also burnishing his own reputation. In so doing, he provided transformative largesse to a good-sized cohort of significant American artists.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you to Kim, Betsy, and Lance for your presentations, and Margaret for going over the entire book. It was there's a lot of issues packed into this little guy, so I hope that you guys read it. As a non-Americanist among the group, I did make sort of a collecting observation while we were working on this book over time. And if I could just have the other panelists join us, I am going to show some slides shortly for my observation. And that is that the bibliography of the history of collecting, for the most part, especially in the latter part of the 19th century, is really focused on collecting French art and old masters. In fact, many of you might be familiar with this image by Theodore Woost of Samuel Putnam Avery transporting his treasures across the sea. If you look at the crates, you'll see all the different types of work of art that he's bringing from Europe to the United States for his clients. However, again, non-Americanist, did you know that the Leutze, Washington crossing the Delaware, actually was imported from Germany? And it was by a German immigrant. So I didn't know that. And it was sold initially by Goupil, a French gallery operating in New York. And 2 years after it was sold in 1851 to an American industrialist, it was then printed by another gallery with roots in Europe, Knoedler and Company, and a limited edition print and sold. So there was a lot of interest in this picture. You'll see in Linda's introduction, it came out on all these different exhibitions to raise money for different sort of causes. So it's really exciting, and it's become the quintessential American history painting, even though its roots are very different. In fact, it's spawned interest by other artists who have started conversations showing you Robert Colescott's painting here, which is at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art in Los Angeles. And here's Jacob Lawrence's Struggles series and Robert Colescott again. And then most recently, Kent Monkman's Resurgence of the People, which you can see in the lobby of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art did a fabulous exhibition kind of contextualizing this called Crossings last year, and you can find that information on their website. So I hope this does spawn some interest from our collecting people for questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Margaret Laster, who has our first question for our panelist.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. And thank you all to all the authors for such insightful presentations, as were they were terrific, as were the wonderful essays you wrote. This is a very broad question, and some of you have answered this already, but maybe you can think of another answer or expand on it. We were wondering if all of you or any of you can share with us if there's a particular facet of your findings or research that was most surprising as it pertained to your topic, or to your understanding of the broader history of collecting American art, and or if there's any point that you discussed in your presentations that you wanted even to elaborate on further.
I mean, I'll just quickly say that I think I stated it, but I didn't really have time to go into it. But I feel like the relationship between Wadsworth and Cole and Elizabeth Colton Church was, it was kind of an American artist patron example where it's not sort of hierarchy telling, the artists what it was a shared experience. And because of Cole and Church's storyline in Hartford, the Wadsworth Athenaeum became a huge success. And because I ran out of time, I should have said that Elizabeth Cole bequested her entire collection to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, certainly encouraged by Church, who retained very close connections in Hartford, his hometown. And she left it in her own name, she was the first woman to do that, and gave money to build a museum wing for her collection. But I feel like, although when I think about Gilmore, so Lance might have some thoughts. Gilmore was a more, I think, traditional patron, maybe, but it's kind of fascinating when I explored the letters and the friendship and how some of the greatest landscapes by Cole and Church were influenced by Wadsworth and Colt.
That's so interesting.
Well, I have to counter that immediately.
Okay.
Because that is one topic that, I feel like Gilmore as a collector has been portrayed often for the past, especially back in the James Thomas Flexner era, of like being the un-American patron because he was demanding. And I think we just heard from Lynn that clearly her collector was very demanding. Mm-hmm. And you can be supporting and demanding at the same time. And I think we've been led to believe kind of what Elizabeth said, that American collections, though, they should just be like pals and talk to each other and have a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or something. And Gilmore is certainly from an older generation. He's similar in age to Wadsworth. But I think that duality of like, what is an American patron? I think we need to know more about them because there's so few that we have a lot of dialogue from. Having dialogue between the patrons, between the patron and the collector that's so rare. And so obviously there is great letters with Wadsworth and Cole and Gilmore and Cole. and that you can kind of look at them as different. Now, I mean, Gilmore always was very demanding, but he always said, but I leave it to your best judgment. So at the end of the day, he kind of turned it back to, it was supposed to be a little educational for him, of what he was talking about. And I think he felt that was part of his duty as someone who had some knowledge, had a collecting, that he should help form and shape. So anyway, it's kind of, I'm on the screen between the two of these folks, and it's kind of a middle ground between what they both said.
Well, picking up on that, most of our knowledge of patrons and patronage has to do with individual collectors dealing with individual artists, with whatever letters we can find. And the art union sort of makes that a public conversation that gets turned up to 11 really quickly, because people start asking questions. What knowledge do you bring to the table that allows you to make these judgments with a great deal of money, of which I've contributed my part? And it raises these questions of authority and of expertise that are really fascinating, that are only bringing to light conversations that were probably happening very quietly behind the scenes until that point.
I'll just jump in if I may. Specifically, of course, it was surprising to find the letter, which I didn't, and then I have a general remark too, but I didn't recognize the letter as being from Nicholas Longworth. I found it early in my research, and it was signed, "You Know Who." And it was this very interesting sort of sardonic, mordant voice that I started thinking about who in Cincinnati could have. It reminded me of Ambrose Bierce or Mark Twain. And I started thinking, what author from Cincinnati could have written this letter? And I thought of, ran through all the authors I knew of who were writing, and nobody came to mind. And I put it aside, and I thought, well, if I can't figure out who wrote it, how can I trust it, And then later I read a lot of Nicholas Longworth's letters at the Cincinnati Historical Society. And suddenly I recognized the voice. It was him. And it was unmistakably him. And then the signature, "You Know Who," made perfect sense. So that was the big surprise for me. But I also wanted to say more generally, the facet of my findings that I think has the broadest application for all of us in the field is the incredible resource provided by all the newly digitized newspapers. All the archives of newspapers across the country, linked or not linked, available sometimes just through the local public library that's archiving and digitizing their own collections. This is an unbelievable trove of things that have been, nobody's laid eyes on for over 100 years in some cases. So I just wanted to say, for me, that was a revelation that has affected all my subsequent research.
I'm just going to chime in real quick. I see people are asking out where they can purchase the book in the chat and in the questions. I'm going to put in a discount code for Penn State Press in the chat momentarily that you can use for 40% off for joining us today. And then I'll turn it back to Margaret and Linda to continue our wonderful panel.
Linda, do you have any questions?
Well, I have many questions. A good book and a good conference always raises lots more questions than answers. But this has been very stimulating because we created the book. All of us worked in solitude during the preparation of the book, more solitude than usual, given lockdown and other challenges. And then the book was shaped, Margaret and I had the benefit, immense benefit for me, probably the most transformative. I provided the introduction, which is always a thankless task, but it was a challenge. And I'm glad that we came up with something with a lot of help that I think is a good introduction to the book, and stands alone as a kind of mini history of collecting in the United States based on these particular sources. But I was amazed at and I've talked about this with Samantha and with Margaret, the number of threads. I mean, we were very ambitious. We wanted to get from the East Coast to the West Coast. We wanted to carry this story. We wanted to go to the South, and we wanted to go to the Midwest. And we wanted this story of collecting to move beyond the focus, which is logical and understandable, on the northeastern coast, the cities along the northeastern coast of the United States. And we were thrilled to be able to find art historians, doing research in particular areas who were willing to take on the issue of collecting. And it was very exciting working with Lynn, for example, because we kind of shared her pilgrimage toward this, which is in a sense a revelation about understanding the attitude of someone who had been assumed, like Longworth, to have his largesse, his interest focused on a basis of abolitionist commitment. And then, of course, it was, the American Pre-Raphaelites have been staring at us all for years, and they're still very strange. I mean, having been involved in work on the American Pre-Raphaelites for a very long time, I think we sort of got them out now with the essay here in this volume on the patrons, but then again, the focus on the Civil War. The mixture of the demonstration and working on this book and working with the authors, the span, the geographical span, the time span of the huge impact that the moment has. Is it before the war? Is it the run up to the war? Is it the revolution? Is it after the war? Is it what we call the Gilded Age? Is it the battle between representation and abstraction in the 20th century? I mean, but it's not the same cycle, but it's animated by these frictions. And that was the fascinating aspect.
Yeah, I mean, Linda, you're really, bringing all this to life again. We're reliving it. That's wonderful. But I think we have some audience questions.
Sure.
We have 12 audience questions, and I'm just going to start with the first one that I see, and then I'll go back through in the order that they came. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Miss Ambrosini, the painting that says its location is Middlesex County, is that the original location? There is a Middlesex County. Thank you. Looking forward to getting the book.
Was that the Thomas Sully portrait? I'm not sure. Middlesex County. I'm trying to just remember my presentation. The locations. I mean, it was years ago now that we worked on all of these things.
Isn't it the Longworth daughters at a Longworth site?
Oh, yeah, that's it. Thank you. It's the Longfellow daughters.
Longfellow daughters. Sorry, getting my Longworths. Yes.
I do not know if that was the original location. It came from Longworth's own collection in Massachusetts. That's all I can tell you. And it's still at the Longfellow house. So I assume that was its original location.
Great, thank you. Lance, there was one attendee who wanted to see if you could share your first slide again. Is that possible?
Yes.
And while you do that, I'll just go ahead and ask another question so we can try to get through some of these. This is from Scott Dockvarn. He says, how do you see the relationship between collectors and artists today? It appears to be more about value and investment rather than about the story and skill of the artist. For anybody.
I mean, I could say, I mean, today there's so many layers between the buyer and the artist. You know, there's a dealer, there's an art consultant, there's, you know, the art fair. I mean, I feel like there, you know, I'm sure there are certainly exceptions to that rule, but very often art collectors today are buying for investment. So it's just a very different world. And the level of money is so different. There was a letter from Cole to Wadsworth when he sold Mount Etna to Wadsworth, begging him to pay him more than I think it was $300 that Wadsworth offered him. So it's like the worlds have transformed dramatically, and the marketplace of dealer, advisor, art fair gets in the way, I think, of very strong relationships between artists and patrons.
Betsy, I think you've caught on to something really interesting there, because the art union functioned as sort of an intermediary, and they do create that kind of issue where art is under constant threat of becoming a commodity. And there were certainly instances of people having a painting distributed to them and then turning around and writing the art union and saying, well, would you buy this back from me? You know, and that's where the lottery question becomes a very serious concern. And the art union, they're so wonderful. They always in all these instances, they would write back and talk about how important the painting is and how great the artist is. And of course, turn down, you know, this request to buy it back, but trying to instill this idea that we're not here to create a cash prize for you. So I think that
they even
concern is
changed
evergreen.
Titles of paintings. I know the famous George Caleb Bingham, fur traders descending the Missouri. Bingham's title was fur trader with his half-breed son, and the American Art Union would not accept that title. So they were altering, you know, the artist's intent. Yeah.
And there become these criteria that start to shape the market, that they start to talk to artists saying, well, could you send us something more pleasant? Or something smaller so that it will fit in someone's home and not this enormous thing you would need to build a gallery in order to accommodate. It's fascinating how this starts to shape things.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
I have another question. This is from Alan Wallach.
So Samantha, what am I supposed to do with my first slide here? Sorry.
Oh, you can stop sharing now.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much. I'll return to Alan Wallach's question. He says, could any of the authors speak to the question of explicit motives for patronage and collecting and motives that were implicit, that has not been articulated? Some examples: desire for status, accumulation of cultural capital, to use Bordeaux's formulation, and reputation laundering. There's more in the book, Alan.
I mean, Alan has written brilliantly about this topic, and I certainly relied heavily on his work in investigating Cole and Wadsworth. And we, you know, in our 10-minute presentations, we can only encourage you to read our essays, but you're absolutely right. There was for Wadsworth, he wanted to celebrate his family's history and, you know, the role they played in the Revolutionary War. He wanted it preserved for future generations. And then he saw landscape art as a morally uplifting subject for American citizens to, you know, the U.S. landscape and its unique qualities. But that's just a tiny, and you have written about this, as I said, brilliantly.
I would say to Alan, this is Linda Ferber, that I think we'll find Barbara Galati's essay on Untermeyer of particular interest, because he collected without particularly being interested in a legacy. I mean, his legacy was jurisprudence. He collected because he wanted to surround himself with the kind of visual symbols of wealth that many of the people he was going after in court, enjoyed. It was Gilded Age, and so it's fascinating. And the collection was sold, and his name is not part of the known provenance of the Whistler. And Barbara speculates a little bit without giving things away that, some of the interest in that at least might have been that it was involved in a very, very famous lawsuit, the Ruskin Whistler trial. So that's the one to me of all of these that cuts against assumptions. And there's nothing wrong with assumptions. I mean, there were many motives, but that's a particularly fascinating essay to me.
And I also just wanted a quick shout out to Alan Wallach, who appears throughout our volume as a as a critic or as art historian whose work we so value. And in my essay, I really only spoke very briefly about the Lumen Reed collection, but I used his writings in kind of analyzing the New York Gallery of the Fine Arts, which is where Reed's collection went before it went to the New York Historical Society, and the difficulties they had sustaining themselves in pre-Civil War New York culture. So we frequently, when we were working on our bibliography and the notes, we said, oh, there's Alan Wallach again. So I think I hope, Alan, you'll be pleased. Thank you.
Samantha, I thought you were going to ask me whoever asked to see my first slide, if Gilmore is this big patron of American art, why is his portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence? That's what I thought the question was going to be there. But I would like to speak to that very briefly because, and it speaks a little bit to what Alan is hinting in his question. I mean, Gilmore, he had these connections, as you know, from previous Frick talks I've done. I mean, he had European connections with the Baryons in London, with his father's business. They were not from the revolutionary generation, Betsy, like the Wadsworth, and they were new to America in the 1770s and 80s. But having made these international connections and having that kind of wealth, he certainly wanted to arrive home with his portrait and his wife's portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence, to kind of demonstrate that he is part of this international culture, that he is not just here in America and has never gone to Europe. And that portrait was certainly a symbol of what that being in this international sphere meant to him. And also it was to serve as a model for American artists. I mean, I think there's 4 American artists I can document that actually saw that painting. And they wanted to go to his house specifically to see this portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence, because he was one of the famous painter of the early 19th century in Europe. So anyway, I thought that's where they were going to go with that, but I think it's kind of an interesting part of his career.
No, that was great. And I'm acutely aware of the time. We're just now past the half hour at 1:31. So I think this is a great place to end. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to all the questions. Please read the book and have a great day. Great afternoon. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you to the Frick.